everyone, and welcome. I am thrilled that you could join us here on this beautiful Tuesday. And, we are pretty close to Thanksgiving, and I certainly want to give thanks to you for being here. I want to give thanks for the opportunity to have this incredible conversation with you and what I think is arguably the best panel that we could have put together to talk about a really important topic, which is the future of news. I know it was just mentioned about the Q&A at the bottom of our screen. Please use it. We definitely want you to drive this conversation and be able to hear the expertise that's here before us today. Our conversation is going to be broken up basically into four pieces, modules, if you will. The first one we're going to talk about is the incredible career of one of our guests here, Len Downie, Ohio State alum. We are so proud he could join us today. We're also going to talk about the challenges of current media and its model and maybe the new news model that's forthcoming. We want to talk about the next generation of journalists and journalism and the role of media in society, which we could argue has never been more important. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists today. First up, we have Jerry Kosicki, who is a longtime faculty member in the School of Communication. He's worked as a reporter and editor. He studies public opinion and political communication, and he's the chair of the school's Journalism Studies Committee. Thank you so much for being here, Jerry. I'd like to introduce Jasmine Hilton, who's the managing editor for content at The Lantern. She previously served as a special projects editor, and she's interned with NBC Washington, the Ohio State Alumni Magazine, and she's looking forward to interning with the Washington Post, appropriately enough for this conversation, on the national desk in June of 2021, and her graduation is in May. Welcome, Jasmine, and congratulations on your pending graduation. We'd like to also welcome Sam Rowdens, who is editor-in-chief of The Lantern, who has also interned at the Ohio Center for Investigative Journalism and the Columbus Dispatch. She's going to be going back to the Columbus Dispatch, I hear, and she is also going to be graduating in May. So welcome, Sam. And Spencer Hunt joins us, who is a journalism lecturer and advisor for The Lantern. He spent more than 20 years as a reporter working in Ohio for the Cincinnati Enquirer and the Columbus Dispatch, and now he advises us on how to do journalism best at Ohio State. Welcome, Spencer. And finally, last and definitely not least, we'd like to welcome Leonard Downie Jr., a professor at Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism, the former executive editor of the Washington Post. In his 44 years at the Post, Len was also an investigative reporter, editor of the Watergate story, London correspondent and managing editor, and his new book is a memoir, all about the story, news, power, politics, and the Washington Post. Welcome, Len. Welcome, everyone. We're so happy that you're here. So Len, I immediately ran out and got your book because I couldn't wait to read it. And I figured if we're all going to be spending so much time at home, I needed to have good reading. So what I'd like to do now is turn over this conversation about this book and your experiences and hear more about your time at The Lantern. And I'm going to turn it over to two amazing journalists, Jasmine and Sam.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Hi, Mr. Downie. It's so nice to see you again. Thanks for joining us. So yeah, we're so excited to talk about your book today, and I'd like to kick it off. And in the introduction, you really begin the whole story with the fact that you haven't often written about yourself. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what it was like to kind of sit down and reflect on your career and what it was like to see it all down on paper.
That's a very good question. I'd written 6 previous books, including a novel. The novel actually was called The Rules of the Game, actually had a lot of my career in it, but masked, in fictional form, but it was based on a lot of my experiences. So, but that was as close as I'd come to writing about myself. I succeeded Ben Bradlee as the executive editor of the Washington Post. I worked with him as his managing editor for 7 years. He was a bigger than life guy, portrayed in the movie All the President's Men and so on. And it just came naturally to me to be, from my Midwest upbringing in Cleveland, Ohio, and my time at Ohio State, to be a more modest person, I guess, more self-effacing person. And I was such an active editor that I really was working through other people. I followed Ben's precept that you hire the best people you can, people that are smarter than you are, more talented than you are, and you help them do their best work. So that's the way I worked. I worked through other people. So to come to this point, to finally write this book was different compared to the other things that I'd written. In part, I did it because Bob Woodward ordered me to do so. You know how many books Bob Woodward's written? And I was musing with him one day about whether or not I should do this. I after I left the Post, I got all my files together and had all this material. And I just was wondering whether I should do it. And Bob said I must do it because of the experiences that I had at the Washington Post. So I did it.
Well, I think that gives you a good enough reason to do it. And so, diving in a little bit, bringing it home, you said you're from the Midwest, and I wanted to talk about the Lantern a little bit.
Yes.
You held a few positions during your time at Ohio State and at the Lantern, as described in your book. And I was wondering if we could talk about, how your time at the Lantern shaped your later career.
It was extremely important to me. I had already been a student journalist in the 5th grade in elementary school, 5th and 6th grades, and again in junior high, and again in high school. But it was nothing like the experience that I had at the Lantern. It was a 5-day-a-week paper, 30,000 circulation, didn't go to bed at night till 1 in the morning. The paper didn't. And so it covered in real time not only the whole world of Ohio State, as you all are doing now, but also the city of Columbus and the state of Ohio as it applied to Ohio State. We even ran wire copy on the most important national, international news. We were trying to be a one-stop newspaper for the people on the campus. And so it was an extraordinary experience. I was a reporter. I was the sports editor. I covered Ohio national championship, Ohio State, excuse me, football teams and basketball teams, which was a great fun, traveling around the country with those teams, getting to know those athletes. And then I was managing editor of the paper during a very busy time, and I was editor of the editorial page.
Hi, Mr. Downey.
And I should add, Jasmine, I'm sorry to interrupt, I should add that the then director of the School of Journalism, the late George Kinzel, also was instrumental in my getting an internship at the Washington Post, which I never would have gotten otherwise in the summer of 1964, which launched my career at the Post. Sorry, Jasmine.
Oh, no, it's totally fine. Following Sam's question, I was going to ask if you had any memorable moments at the Lantern, memorable stories that you covered.
Yes, several. One was I covered a meeting of the faculty the year that the Ohio State football team was voted the national championship champion. There was no national championship game at that time. It was done by wire service votes of coaches and sports writers. And they had won the national championship. They obviously won the Big Ten championship. They were undefeated. I think they had one tie against TCU. I can still remember that in the opening game of the season. But otherwise, they were the best team in the country. And of course, they were destined to go to the Rose Bowl, except at the faculty bench. It was a time in which they were worried about whether or not football was too important at Ohio State, something I know you can't imagine now. And so I covered this meeting. Woody Hayes was a member of the faculty council, is a full professor, by the way, full professor of Civil War history. And they voted by one vote to not allow the team to go to the Rose Bowl, which itself was a big story. And then at a time when other campuses were having, riots and things about free speech and other important subjects, the students at Ohio State decided to have a riot about not going to the Rose Bowl and marched all the way down to the State House. And it seemed like the Columbus police were helping them along the way and helping out this march. So I covered that story. I also learned something about learned a life lesson about the separation of opinion and news coverage. Because at another point, when I was the editor of the editorial page, I was working late one night in the newsroom, pretty much all alone in the Lantern newsroom, when the then president of Ohio State, whose name was Novice Fawcett, locked out of a campus building a left-wing speaker that had been invited to speak there by a faculty member. And the faculty member moved the students who wanted to get into the auditorium and the speaker to a house near the campus where he spoke there instead. So I wrote a news story about this development, which was the lead news story on the front page of the paper. And then I walked over to my editor of the editorial page desk, and I wrote an editorial condemning the president for doing that. And it only dawned on me afterwards that this was not something you should do, and was a good life lesson for me. And I've often used it while trying to convince journalists at the Washington Post to observe the difference between opinion and news coverage.
Thank you for sharing. And I had another question as well in relation to this year in particular. You said in your book, quote, "For the calling to which I have devoted my life, times like this are all about the story." Could you talk more about the commitment you've made to journalism and also just carrying the responsibility of a journalist throughout your entire career?
Yes, I believe that journalists are different from other citizens. In fact, when I was running the Post newsroom under Ben and then by myself for 25 years, I did not vote. I purposely stopped voting because I had the final say over what went in the newspaper every day. And I did not want to make up my mind who should be president or who should be mayor of Washington, D.C., or what decisions should be made about the major issues of the day. and just keep a completely open mind as much as possible in making those final decisions about what went into the newspaper. And also for the rest of the staff, of course, they were allowed to vote, but they also they could not engage in any other kind of political activity, could not raise money for politicians, contribute to politicians, sign petitions, contribute to organizations that lobby Congress at all parts of the spectrum, and put lines, put signs in their lawn or anything like that. They could only vote. So they were giving up some of their rights as citizens for the right as journalists at the Washington Post to join together in exercising our First Amendment right to publish whatever we saw fit to publish. And so that's always been very important to me. I've always thought of journalists as being somebody other than other citizens, having a different kind of life. We're the observers, we're not the doers. And that's it. Nowadays with the internet and with social media, I think that's a harder distinction for journalists to understand, because we all have feelings, and some journalists have opinions, and they want to sometimes say things to their friends or to the general public on the internet without thinking about the fact that they should still remain others. And the last thing I always tell my students is that this is a very, very demanding profession. Particularly nowadays. Even in my day, I was never home for supper all the time I ran the newspaper, for example. My family had to get used to that, and my families had to get used to that. It's not good for your social life, and particularly nowadays with the internet, it's a 24-hour job for many journalists. You can never tell when you're going to have to wake up and cover something or do something on the internet. So you need to understand that it's a big commitment. I consider it a mission. That being a journalist nowadays is a mission.
Thank you, Mr. Downey. We have really just one more question for you. So throughout your book, you tell us about your storied career that include, Watergate, like you mentioned, the Unabomber's ultimatum and that sort of thing, things that we are literally taught in ethics courses now and media law that I TA with Nicole. To sum it up, there was a great quote in your book that says, this book is the story of my uncommon career in journalism and what it illuminates about the past, present, and future of news. So with all these things in mind, you sort of touched on it, but what advice would you give to journalism students at Ohio State? And, what do you hope journalism as a whole learns from your career?
Right. Well, first of all, for the students, it's really important that today's journalism students learn all the different skills involved in multimedia journalism today. Because you can never tell which skill it is that is going to be the reason why you get hired initially. Whether it's your ability to deal with video, or your ability to do photography, or your ability to code, who knows what it is, in addition to reporting and writing, which of course in storytelling. Storytelling comes in all these different forms now, myriad forms, new forms being invented every day. 5 years ago, podcasts were a kind of something you occasionally heard about. Today, podcasts are everywhere, for example. Tomorrow it'll be something else, probably something having to do with video that we cannot imagine yet. So that's extremely important. And the other thing, of course, is what I said earlier. Realize that this is a mission. Realize that you really want to do this. This is not a 9-to-5 job. This is something that really demands everything of you. So that's what I would encourage journalism students to do. What was the other part of your question now? I've forgotten.
Just what you hope journalism learns from your career as a whole.
Right. Yes. Well, the fact that it's a mission, the fact that we really are, that fact-finding journalists really are nonpartisan. I know that's hard to understand nowadays when there are many news organizations that are purposely partisan, but the fact-finding news organizations are nonpartisan. And all the things I show in my book that I did, decisions that I made show that that was the case, and that was important to the kind of journalism we did. National security decisions involving politics, investigating presidents of the United States, all sorts of things like that, all done in a nonpartisan way. And I think that's a really important lesson to take away from the book, and the importance of news in our democracy.
Thank you, Mr. Downey.
Well, that was amazing. And I think it segues beautifully into kind of the theme of what we're going to talk about today. And Len, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I do want to ask you, we look back at Watergate as this watershed moment for journalism. It's never been, more accomplished. It had never, done such a perfect job in a perfect storm of standing up to government and providing that fourth estate supervision that we so desperately needed. And if you bookend that with where we are now, and I know that it was not like that in the midst of it, and I'm wondering, how do you bookend the experiences that the media is having now in coverage of government and the circumstances that you saw at Watergate, and what can we take away from the 70s that maybe could give us some hope now that journalism is going to be on its way back to that fourth
Right.
estate role?
Before Watergate, with the exception of the turn of the 20th century muckrakers during the time of President Roosevelt, who really invented investigative reporting for the United States. But then there was a long period with all the wars and McCarthyism and so on, in which there was really no national investigative reporting whatsoever, and only scattered local investigative reporting like the kind that I did in the 1960s. Watergate changed that. Watergate created the idea that national investigative reporting was essential to holding government, corporations, everybody in all walks of life with power and influence over the American public was essential. What I call accountability journalism, holding everybody accountable who have power and influence over the rest of us. And so that's continued until today, and it's been going on right now, as we've seen during this administration, as well as the preceding administrations, but particularly during this one now. And in fact, even now, as in this whole question of recognizing the results of the election, you see investigative reporting continuing. That's really important, and I hope that people will understand, even as they feel terribly partisan one way or the other about the president and about all the other issues in our society, racial issues, for example, racial justice issues, for example, global warming, et cetera, that it's all of which people properly have great passions about, that they'll recognize that they need facts from a news media that is going to hold power accountable in a factual way. And that's what I hope is the lesson of Watergate today. I still think it's a great idea for all Americans to see 3 movies about journalism: All the President's Men, more recently, the Post, which is about the Washington Post decision to publish the Pentagon Papers, which led into Watergate, and Spotlight, which was the Boston Globe's investigation of the Catholic Church. All those movies are completely accurate, and they show that the journalists involved were nonpartisan, that they were following their leads, and not knowing what the outcome would be. For the longest time, Watergate lasted for 2 years, and for the longest time, we had no idea that in the end, the President of the United States would be impeached, much less would actually resign from office. That was not something we predetermined to set out to do.
And Jerry, I'd love for you to kind of expand on that, because one of the benefits, of course, that we've had over those 3 examples that Len gave us were robust news staffs and family-owned newspaper entities, and we're not seeing that now. We're seeing, and Tracy Ward's mentioning about media conglomerates, the same company owning a great deal of news entities. Her friend lost her job because the news organizations are consolidating. So who will be the watchdogs of government from your perspective if journalism continues to shrink in this manner?
Well, that's a really good question. And, you're right to say that the ownership of news has changed dramatically since the meltdown, the financial meltdown of 2008. What we've seen is a great growth in private equity companies owning what used to be family-owned or maybe corporate-owned businesses, especially in medium-sized and smaller towns. What we've seen is that the newspapers are been bought up by private equity. They move the company to the edge of town. They convert their building into an office building or a Starbucks or something like that. And then, if they can't become profitable, they close it and or sell it. And then if they can't make it going, then they sell it and it goes out of business. And so we have relatively large swaths of the country where there's really no local news. And the gap there is felt in terms of is filled in terms of more ideologically based cable news in many respects, and this really doesn't help the cause of democracy very much. every community is a little bit different. Everybody needs some special solutions. And, just the idea that you have some kind of fixed ideology about the nature of taxes or lack of them, or size of government or whatever. Communities may have different needs depending on the stage of development they're in, whether they're growing or static or falling apart. You're going to need different kind of leadership and different kinds of solutions, different amounts of spending to kind of get through the trouble. And unfortunately, it's not easy to see how that's going to happen. Now, I think Len can talk a little bit about, he's actually studied this and written about this in great detail. But material organizations that spring up in the community, nonprofit news organizations or other things, even when a newspaper lays off a staff with hundreds of years of experience, those people could actually think about working together in a nonprofit way. They could maybe earn a little bit less money than they're used to, but if they went online, they probably could reduce the costs really low. And if they could attract some kind of advertising, they might be able to make that kind of business work. And we're seeing other organizations pop up, trying to just operate online. But it is harder to operate online, as we know at the Lantern, because the ads that you can sell just fetch much less money. And it's a lot less, 10 to 15 times as less. Or a print ad will be 15 or maybe 20 times more expensive than a comparable online ad. So that's a really big challenge.
No question. And Spencer, I'd hope maybe you can jump in with some thoughts on challenges. When we started talking about this and we had this topic, the challenge of the current media model, there's so many, like it's hard to narrow it down. And we have disinformation, and we have this idea of news deserts, and we have the distrust of media. We have, you and I were on a panel recently about disinformation and misinformation and malinformation. So what are you seeing as the biggest challenges? And as you're trying to educate the next generation of journalists, what are you trying to prepare them for?
When we're trying to prepare journalists, I think it's important for them to be conscious of the environment that they're going into. And so I talk quite a bit about what the realities on the ground are business-wise for news organizations. And so, Jerry was just talking about how, print advertisements generate so much more money still than a digital advertisement. And so if you're a newspaper, you're in this bottleneck where the digital is the future, but it's only paying you a fraction of what it is that you get. And so, there was this thing came out, this stat that I use a lot. Is like for every dollar that you gain in digital revenue, you've lost like $13 in print advertising. And so we need our journalists to be cognizant of what it is that they're walking into, but also the opportunities that they face. And so if we're training our journalists in the skills that news organizations need, right? And you and I, we both talked with Alan Miller at the Dispatch about what it is that they're looking for in interns, so that our students could be competitive with other journalism school programs. And he said, and I think it's kind of endemic for the rest of the industry, they need all of these skills in one person, right? Photography, videography, data crunching, coding, and how to report and write, right? And so all of those things together, we need to prepare our journalists to go into the world with all of these skills, because that's what these news organizations are needing. And as they're looking for some way to get through that bottleneck, those are the kinds of people that they need to come to help them along that way.
Can I add something to that, Nicole?
Absolutely.
To what both Jerry and Spencer said, there's change going on at the same time. And in addition to the discouraging changes, there are encouraging changes. People are getting used to the fact that you will pay for subscriptions to news organizations online. Remember when the internet started out, became very popular, the word was from the so-called experts that you're not going to pay for anything on the internet, it's all free. Well, tell that to Amazon, right? You can't, people are paying for news. They're beginning to pay for news. That's one encouraging thing. And so for instance, at the Washington Post and New York Times, their largest source of income are paid subscriptions. Now, they obviously are national, international news organizations, so that helps, but their advertising is now a fraction of their paid subscriptions. Secondly, Jerry mentioned nonprofits. There's a huge, completely disconnected nonprofit trend going on in the country. As Jerry said, people are leaving other news organizations, starting their own nonprofits locally and in small towns and cities, sometimes statewide like the Texas Tribune, sometimes nationally like ProPublica, and they raise money from foundations. They charge memberships like public television and radio do. And so it's very important for the American public to understand that after getting their news essentially free for decades and decades, completely subsidized by advertising, paying very little for subscription prices, nothing for television, but now they pay for cable. But they need to chip in. The American public needs to chip in and start paying for news in all these variety of ways.
Absolutely.
It's a very interesting thing that I think it was Pew that did a survey not that long ago about, that they thought that one of the findings was that people thought that their media, their local media that they read, were doing just fine economically. But on the other hand, they found that something like about only 15% actually subscribe to any kind of
Right.
like a newspaper or something like that. I mean, it's like, well, how is that possible? It's just this vast gulf of perceptions that is really different. I think you're right to say that there's a big crunch now for media to find subscriber income, and that's really the best place to be right now. And we see that all kinds of organizations now are out trying to, even ones, these online things that were given away for free and they were supported by advertising. Now suddenly they need you to buy a subscription, and they're trying to convert their business model because it's just so much harder to get online ads, in part because of the changes in the advertising business. And
right.
Advertising business has changed very dramatically. And I think it's like we would say a lot of things have changed dramatically and probably not going back, in part because of the twin crises that our country's facing right now, the pandemic and the economic fallout from that. And so one of the things that we've seen is that there's kind of a lot of the social changes that were ambient before this, work from home, fast casual food, carry out food, all these kinds of things, shopping online, that those trends all accelerated dramatically in the springtime. And people have used the phrase like 10 years of social change in 10 weeks of the first 10 weeks of the pandemic. And what's interesting to note, I think, is that many of these changes are really not going to go back. I mean, things have changed, and they're changed. So big companies that had vast office parks, they may not put their employees all back in those office buildings anymore.
You're totally right. I'm wondering if we could I want to make sure that our students I see Sam has been eager to jump in here. Sam, can you help us kind of navigate these waters from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to jump in off of something Mr. Downey had talked about. And, this is a change that we've also rapidly seen at the Lantern, and there's no question about it. We had to cut down our printing schedule. We are only special editions now for the time being, but it has also, on a positive note, has also lent us a little bit more flexibility and an opportunity to really take the time to be digital first. We learned a lot about how quickly the industry can change and what the industry will be demanding going forward, and just in the last 6 months since the pandemic began. And, like I said, there's added flexibility that I just feel like we're kind of breaking this mold a little bit, where the Lantern has been such an institution, and there are certain things that are very set in their ways. But I think our staff has really relished the opportunity to sort of push those boundaries and see what we can do. We've had more social media engagement than ever before this year. We've had more multimedia than ever before this year. We have a much larger email subscriber list than ever before. It's really given us an opportunity to get a better read on our audience and see how much further we can go and how we can make it stick.
I'm looking at, I'm so impressed about, Sam, the work that you've done at the Dispatch. But we have a note here from someone who notes that a lot of newspapers today aren't reporting news. And I know at the Dispatch, their deadline has been moved up so dramatically that it takes me 48 hours to find out what news has broken, if I want to see it in print. And we have another question here about under what circumstances print markets for newspapers will survive. Jasmine, maybe you could help us as you're getting ready to enter this marketplace. What are your thoughts about kind of this changing dynamic of what is news and whether print has a place anymore?
I think it's one of those things where everyone is trying to navigate it. I know, especially a place where I'm at all the time is Twitter, and still seeing a lot of journalists happy and excited to see their work in print. I know that when a story I did for the Post over the summer went to print, I was super excited about it. And so I think that the narrative that print all of a sudden will go out of style in a sense is something that is a bit of a skewed narrative, because I know that there are still people who treasure print. And so I think that there's something to navigate in terms of finding a balance within how do we continue to be digital first, as Sam was saying, as Mr. Downey was saying, as the environment changes from year to year, how do we stay digital first, but also, keeping those roots? Because I think that the roots and the values of print journalism, and even what that means for someone to see something in print and the steps that it takes, to get there in terms of credibility wise, could even assist with that, even in terms of credibility, which we'll get to later in the conversation. But I think it's definitely comes down to just navigation and keeping that balance.
Absolutely. And Len, the role of the newspaper as the first edition of history, we seem to be kind of losing that grasp. And when publishing has now moved away from print, which was a finite medium, to everyone can publish, and social media giving so many opportunities for voices to be out there, how does news move forward to continue to make itself known as the expertise in the room, as opposed to just another one of the cacophony of voices?
To work very hard to continue to do the job well, and to, the other thing that wasn't supposed to happen on the internet is that brands wouldn't matter anymore. Well, brands matter more than ever. The brands of the news organizations themselves, people know what the Washington Post stands for. I presume people in Columbus knows what the Columbus Dispatch is like in terms of a factual news medium. And that's true everywhere else. People know exactly what the broadcast networks news are like, and they know what the different cable news networks are like, and so on. But they also know individual brands. So that at the Washington Post, for example, and this goes back to my time, there were, even in print, there were individual brands. The late David Broder was a nationally known political reporter. Our readers knew who he was, and they trusted in what he reported. He was a brand that mattered. So if he had lived long enough to be on the internet, his brand would matter on the internet. And in fact, his successor as the senior political reporter at the Post, Dan Baltz, does have a brand on the internet, along with the brand of the Washington Post. And so it's important for people to discern amongst these brands between things that are reliable or not reliable, between things they agree with and don't agree with. It was interesting. When I was editor of the Post in the pre-internet days, there were lots of people who didn't like what we reported. If you're being aggressive, if you're doing accountability journalism, there are people that are not going to like seeing themselves reflected in the mirror. And so I would get letters from readers that didn't like some of the things we reported. Interestingly enough, they were quoting things from stories that were deep down in those stories. So even though they were disagreeing with the way in which we were presenting the news, they were reading what we were doing. That was important to them. And so those brands are important in the internet. And we're now seeing nonprofit brands gain some of that importance in localities around the country too. There's something called the Vermont Digger up in the state of Vermont that has a big reputation in Vermont for being the place you go for news, and it's entirely online. So that's going to matter a lot, I think, in the future of news consumption. And in addition to that, there's now something called the news literacy movement. I should have brought my face covering. I've got a face covering from them that has their news literacy movement in white on black because I contributed to it. But it is increasingly, it has tens of thousands now of students around the country that they teach news literacy to, or have educational institutions teach news literacy to, and they're finding ways to try to reach adults as well, to help people sort out the different kinds of things that they're seeing on the internet, to be able to find those brands that are reliable.
Absolutely. You know, we have quite a few questions coming in, and I want to kind of bring them together in a little package of, you know, transitioning to that next generation of journalists and journalism. We always stressed objectivity, fairness, accuracy, but you know, now we have a lot of bias that people would say has entered into the news sphere. And we have punditry kind of crossing over, and we have personalities becoming media enterprises unto themselves. And, you know, my friend Jake Tapper, who I love watching on the news, never hesitates to put his opinion and his, right, and his, you know, his personality into it. Is this the next generation of news? Is this what people have come to expect, and what we now will move forward into?
You know, we older people got used to the fact that there was one kind of news. There were 3 broadcast networks. There were the major newspapers. Then there were the newspapers in each of the towns around the country. And they were all the same. They were all completely supported by advertising. They all separated opinion from news. There were only a few exceptions to that. And so we're all used to that. That's gone. That's gone forever. So that even the best news organizations that are fact-finding news organizations also contain certain amount of opinion, certain amount of analysis. The brands, the aforementioned Dan Baltz never states his personal opinion. I haven't the slightest idea who he votes for, but when I read his analyses called The Take, he's definitely using his expertise to explain things to me, and explains things to me that may look like they might be opinionated, but they're not partisan. And so there's differences between having this sort of voice in journalism, these newsletters and other things that have voice in them, that many of which I read, and those things that are out and out opinion or that distort the news for the sake of a certain partisanship. And that's not going to go away. That is where we are now. Not everything's going to become like that, and not everything's going to go back to the way it was before. And that's why individual news literacy is so important. Citizens who used to be passive receivers of news now can help contribute to the news. An investigative reporter at the Washington Post named David Fahrenthold won the Pulitzer Prize for investigating Donald Trump's foundation and his businesses. And one of the ways he did so was to literally go to Twitter and hold up his notebooks and say, here's what I know so far, what don't I know? And the general public would contribute to his reporting. So people can be more actively involved in journalism. It's called citizen journalism, but also they can be more involved in deciding, here's what I want to find. So maybe I do watch Fox News, and they've got the president saying today that he's not going to concede the election. Well, maybe I better check that out someplace else. And that's an important responsibility of citizens. I know many citizens don't feel that way right now. They like to stick to what, either to Jake Tapper or to somebody on Fox. But I think individual citizen responsibility is an important thing. And I think actually that the communication schools have a role in starting to teach that responsibility to the public.
Well, that's a great segue to you, Jerry. So how do we handle this moving forward? And will we ever see unbiased news again, since people, real or perceived, see so much bias in their coverage?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I would just say that what our school's doing is we have a number of very world-class scholars who study these issues, and of fake news, selective exposure, and selective attention, and all these kind of things. And school's really well known for that. And we're creating a course now. We've had a course for several years on media literacy. And in the new general education curriculum, we're planning to trying to submit that course as one that would fit, and we would teach potentially, very large numbers of students about these matters going forward. And I think, we think that that's a very, very, very important mission for our school and for the university to be doing that. Education for citizenship is one of the really, really, really big important themes, I think, that historically has motivated Ohio State. I think you can find that phrase carved on some buildings around campus, and there's reasons for that, and it is important. And so I think if we're gonna have an ongoing democracy, the kind of government that we're used to, this federal republic, we're going to need a workable system of media that people can buy into, that is going to give information that will be meaningful to help decide how to vote and how to decide issues and evaluate officials and policies and other things.
Yeah, I just want to add that it's not a choice between partisan media and nonpartisan media. Both are going to coexist. So what's important is making sure that the nonpartisan media does use accuracy and fairness as their primary values. I don't believe in objectivity. That's not, I think that's an ephemeral term. I think early coverage of climate change showed the fallacy of that. There's not two sides to climate change. There is climate change, and then there are all the questions about what do you do about it, but that's separate from that. So it's accuracy and fairness that are important to me, and accountability.
And how do you handle that, Jasmine and Sam and Spencer? How do we handle that from a Lantern perspective? In the idealized version, we would focus on that middle ground, but the middle ground is very mushy now, and it's a difficult place to navigate. Sam, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. Well, I think that's a tough question, and that's another thing that we've really worked on learning this year too. I think that having I talked about earlier how we kind of broke the mold of print and how we've been engaging with our audience a lot more, and we've really been able to take the temperature of our audience and see what's important to them. And I do agree with what Mr. Downey said in his example of climate change. Like there's not two sides to climate change. Climate change is happening. And I think it's a matter of taking a step back and looking at an issue holistically and asking yourself, is there two sides to this issue? So, if you're covering something on campus, is there somebody else who has a right to have a voice or a stake in the story? And if the answer is no, and you just continue reporting the story as you were. But if you're talking about an issue, let's say the election, for example, let's say candidates come to campus. If we're covering the Democratic candidate, we're covering the Republican candidate. It really is just a matter of taking a step back and evaluating an issue by issue basis sort of thing.
Jasmine, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I wholly agree with what Sam is saying as well. And especially, I think, as she just said, issue by issue, also day by day, it's something that we have to actively look at because, yes, there are hard issues where that's not changing. There's only one side to that, and we know that to be the truth. And as things progress, and also just looking at it day by day, we're looking at these issues as they continue to develop as well. And also what voices are coming into play, and also what voices are we not keeping track of. There's so many voices that, oh yeah, we know to grab this for that story, or we're definitely going to talk to the university about this, or we're definitely going to talk to this student organization. But it's really important for us to sit back and consider, well, did we take a look at this student organization or that student organization? Who is missing from this piece of news and this story that we're creating? And if that person is missing, or if those persons are missing, how do we begin to incorporate that in our coverage? So down the line, our journalism continues to evolve in the sense that we are being as inclusive and also hearing as many perspectives as possible to remain objective, with that being our overall goal.
Absolutely. Spencer, I think one of the things I struggle with trying to teach, I can teach the existence of misinformation and disinformation, but it's really difficult to teach how our information is being received by others, because if there wasn't a marketplace for disinformation, we wouldn't have so much of it. And so when we're teaching students, and Len, I'd love for you to weigh in on this as well, this has become such a prevalent part of our news coverage now, is confronting disinformation. I mean, we see these posts now on social media that are tagged, that they're disinformation. We have stories that people feel, I see a note here from Joel that there's stories that he thinks the media should have covered, that they covered up in order to prevent negative stories of Joe Biden, when in fact the media would say, well, there wasn't evidence to be reporting on that. How do we kind of balance this climate of so many different versions of what people perceive to be truth?
Well, you're open and transparent about what it is that you're doing. And I think one of the main things that we're trying to teach our the students is, you know, if there's advocacy journalism, there's partisan journalism. I like that term even better. If you're going to go that route, you have to make a conscious decision about what it is that you're doing. And so we want to make sure that our students understand the basics of facts gathering and being accurate and making sure that we understand these issues. And then when we make sure that we are rock solid with our accuracy and our facts, it's then much easier for us to explain to folks who are going to say, well, I don't think you did it right, because the absence of facts on the other side bears out. Now, there's still a lot of passion for what you believe in, but and there may not be any way to change that. But the bedrock of what it is that I think journalists have to, you know, carry with them is, this is what we can prove and this is what we can point to, because this is objectively the truth. And as long as we are in that place, then it's eventually going to bear out, I hope. There's still a lot of people that feel very passionately about what they want to believe in. Well, I think what's important for us to be teaching is what's accurate and what's verifiably true.
I would say add two things to that. That's really good, Spencer. I'd add two things to that. One is, I should have said earlier that in addition to accuracy and fairness, it's pursuit of the truth. Journalists should not be passionate about anything except the pursuit of the truth. If they're passionate about other things, that's for their private lives, but not for their journalism. Secondly, the one thing that has changed is that part of factual reporting now is pointing out things that are false. There's so much falsity being put out there that you're not serving the public well if you don't point out what's false. And I was seeing, for instance, in the reporting just these last few days and weeks now, where when politicians are saying patently false things about the way in which votes are being counted, which that's now being labeled as false every time it's being reported. And that's a fact. So that's a fact to report that it's false. And I know that was a hard bridge for some of us to come across, because that was the kind of language we thought was opinion before, but it's not when it's a fact, when in fact something is not truthful.
No question.
How do you respond when people are pushing back at you with misinformation? And I think it's almost that you have to be like that, right?
Right. And the other thing I just wanted to underline, I'm sorry, Sam, but just real quickly, I just want to underline what Spencer said about transparency. The more we can tell the public about how we do our work, what it is we don't know in stories, in addition to what we do know, how many sources we went to, why are some of them confidential? The more we can talk about, the more we can show what we do, that can dispel some of this sense that, well, this is all made up, this is all fake news. No, here's our work, show our work, like you used to do in complicated mathematical problems. Sam.
I love that comparison. What you guys were saying was something I just wanted to jump in really quickly and talk about, and how this year with the Lantern, I've really seen this tie in directly to a digital first mindset, just because we've done so much in terms of growing our audience on social media and engaging with them. I think the key word there is engaging. When people have questions about what you're doing, or people have a response to what you're doing, I think it's less so sitting there and taking the heat and saying, you know, it'll die down. Having hard conversations with your readers is what will really build back some of that trust that the media has lost. If somebody has an issue with what you're reporting, you know, if they call you, call them back. If they DM you on social media and say, I have questions for you, answer those questions. It's kind of uncomfortable, but that's just how it has to be, because it's transparent and it builds an audience in a place where it might feel sometimes like we're losing an audience if we're losing our print, but we're not. We're really gaining it, and we're building relationships.
Right. And again, none of this is new. During Watergate, the country was evenly divided between those who supported Nixon and thought the Washington Post was terrible, and those who wanted Nixon out and thought the Washington Post was wonderful. So that's not a new thing. And it's also not a new thing that readers used to contact us too back in the old days. You know, it was later than the Pony Express, but it was by mail. Yes, and I did exactly what you said. I would answer them. I would answer their questions. I would explain what it is we're doing. And sometimes you change minds. You know, you change minds, and you would not lose readers because you took the trouble to explain what it was you were doing.
Absolutely. You know, Jay Smith has a really interesting question for you, Len. If you were the age of Jasmine and Sam today, how would you channel the passion that you have for news? What would be the pathway that you would take, and what would you advocate our students take?
Well, there's so many pathways now, which is actually kind of exciting. There's so many different possibilities, not just different kinds of news organizations to work for, but different kinds of skills to apply in your jobs. And I know, for instance, some of my former students who are well employed at places frequently started as not their first love. There was a student who ran all of the student media at Arizona State. She was one of my star investigative reporters in an investigative reporting project. She started at the Washington Post on the website as a decider of what news went on the local website. She now is very senior on Washington Post Digital as a result of that. And the fact that she can write well and report well and edit well all fits into that, even though that's not the way that she started. And so that's often advice I get, is just grab onto a job that's going to get you in the door to a place that's going to be a good place to work. And also be ready to make suggestions. You know more as a result of your education now than probably half the people in any news organization you're going to about this new journalism world, because they have not been learning this. They've been doing their work. And so you should feel free to say, well, maybe we should try this, or I'm willing to try that. And again, I see jobs being created at news organizations, of all different kinds, that never existed before. And they're being created with young people who are uniquely able to fill them.
No question. Jerry, do you have any thoughts on the same thing? If you could go back and do your career over again, or directionalize our students, what would you tell them?
Well, I think it is important to be flexible and to work on multimedia skills, and that's one of the big things that Spencer and I have been working on, since he was hired at the Lantern, is to try to make that more multimedia and more capable of living in on the internet. And it's lucky that we had done that. I think otherwise we would have had a much bigger problem than we have now, trying to adapt to this new environment that we find ourselves in. And I think the staff has been doing a very good job. But when we first began that, there was a lot of pushback. Well, we don't do that. Well, what do we need that for? And it's like, well, those people moved on, and we have people who've grown up in the system now, and they're much more comfortable with it. So I think there's always a kind of inertia in human affairs in some ways, and reality isn't filled with inertia so much. It's a very dynamic environment, and yet you have to adapt to these kind of changing circumstances. And so I think that would be my biggest thing.
We've seen some evolution, looking at Len's book and looking back through some of the past of the Lantern. We really have evolved in the way we cover things. And, John Aller's asking about that we don't run editorials anymore. And it seems like, although we talk about bias in journalism, we have strayed away from some spaces. Sam, can you talk a little bit about that?
I would love to. And I think that's a great question in terms of everything we've talked about today. So I think we ran one editorial so far this year, and it had my name on it. But I think it really ties into what we're talking about now, where for the longest time, this is my third year on staff, and I'm struggling to remember an editorial that took a stance in recent history, but we were taught that it's objectivity always. We don't take stances on issues. We don't endorse candidates, that sort of thing. But, nowadays, I think it's a really good thing to be reconsidering. Like we talked about, not every issue has two sides. And so I think that's a great question, and a great thing for me to reflect on when I get off camera.
Absolutely. Well, we only have a few minutes left, and I have hope, as I always do whenever I get to talk with incredibly smart people, but I also have a sense of desperation, in the sense that we can't run the risk that journalism is going to go anywhere or be compromised in the ways that it appears to be compromised. And I think that we're seeing that now, where truth has become such a question of perception, and it can't be, and we've relied on journalism for such a long time to be that gatekeeper of the information that we needed to have, and we needed to know this to be informed. And now that we have, elected officials who are conveying falsehoods for their own, what appears to be their own benefit, we have social media channels. I'm going to ask each of you to just comment, how do we move from this moment forward to one where journalism has stability and a foundation on which we can build the future of knowledge that we're going to need so desperately for our society to continue? And Jerry, I'm going to ask you to start.
Well, let me just say that democracy, as we understand it today, journalism, media, and popular literacy all grew up at the same time in world history. And that you didn't have democracy without printed materials and people's ability to read them. And as once there became printed materials, people said, hey, it'd be nice to learn how to read, and I could take advantage of that. And then once that happened, then there started to be demands on petitioning of officials, kings and rulers. And you got also this idea of holding officials accountable through that kind of process. And that has really been fundamental. And if we don't, our current governmental system is very much a product of that history. And if you're going to change the information system, it has to somehow adapt to the system, or the government's going to have to adapt. Something's going to have to change to make this all work together. I think the door is kind of open about what that's really going to be. And but I think we're here to be a part of it and try to shape it, and through our students and through our research and writing and so on. So that's kind of where I'm thinking about it.
Great. Jasmine.
Yes, as an emerging journalist, I know Sam probably feels the same way about this, but there are journalists out there who are hungry to tell the truth, hungry to serve our communities, and also hungry for that credibility. And I think the worst thing we could do now is to give up or even give in to the narratives that are out there against journalism. I think we have to keep going, we have to keep trying, and we just have to just keep going, because that's what's important. That's what's going to continue to build that trust, as Mr. Downey was saying, with transparency, not kind of backing away into the shadows, but actually coming forward into the light to be able to show others and show our readers that, yes, we want to continue this mission as it is, as journalism is, and we want to keep going and telling these stories with credibility and objectivity, while also inviting some of those new ideas that we talked about today. So I think it's all a matter of just not giving up and not giving in. Absolutely.
Sam.
Can you tell Jasmine is the other half of my brain? I swear she took my thought right out of my brain. But I was going to say, every time, you walk into the Lantern newsroom and you look at the students that you're teaching, or I'm sure as professors, you guys feel when you walk into a classroom, there's a fire burning in the bellies of young people. And, there's, like Jasmine said, there is a hunger. And how do I say this? If you take COVID for an example, the student journalists covering COVID have never once quit, and they are probably the best example of up and coming journalism in our country. So if those are the people who are going to have journalism in their hands in the next 5 years, I think we're going to be okay. And I think, like Jasmine said, you just have to hang on and hope that, as Jerry said, everything adapts to the way things are going.
Absolutely. Spencer.
I take a lot of inspiration from the students that I get to work with. And so I really like these answers, because I think it reflects the experience that we have here. My thoughts about this are fairly simple. And that is, if you tell a compelling, important, and accurate story, people respond to it.
No question.
And I think the main issue that we have now is, what's the best way for us to tell that story? What's the best medium in which to tell that story? I think it changes with the story. And then how do we get it out there in a way that lots of people connect to it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Len, we'd like to give you the last word on this subject.
Okay, well, I agree with all of that. I'm inspired by Jasmine and Sam. They know that from a previous meeting I had with them and the other talented senior people at the Lantern. It's very exciting to me. Oh God, how many years is this now? 50, 60, 70 years since I was there, something like that. Um, and the fact that it is just as inspiring to me now as it was when I was working on the lantern is very exciting to me. And I encourage you all to keep going. In answer to your larger question, we have to get used to the idea that there are many, many voices. And actually, if you go back to the beginnings of our country, when you had the early journalists who were telling the truth, but who were also advocates, and some of them were party line people. There were the journalists that were attacking Jefferson and the journalists that were defending Jefferson. There was Jefferson, who we always quote for all of the things he says about a free press, who actually was sometimes trying to suppress parts of that free press when he didn't agree with it. There was John Adams, who briefly had into law the Alien Sedition Act, under which they actually arrested reporters for committing journalism, and that disappeared. This is what this country's like, and we're going through a very turbulent period with lots of crises. And journalism, to me, is playing a very, very important role in providing as much information for the American people to cope with these crises as possible in all the different voices that it has.
Absolutely. Well, I know that I speak for everyone who's here with us today in thanking our incredible panelists. Thank you so much. Thank you, Len Downey, for coming home and being part of this incredible conversation with us. Please know how much we're grateful that you joined us for this, and we hope that you will keep reading The Lantern, which you can reach at thelantern.com. And I know that we didn't get to all of your questions, but please feel free to reach out to us. We're always happy to hear from you, and we very much want to keep this conversation going. So thank you to everyone who was here today. Thank you for our panelists, and we wish everyone to stay safe and be careful out there.